You have driven past the water before without thinking twice about it. The retention pond behind the shopping plaza. The canal running along the back of a golf course, flat and green, and lined with the kind of manicured grass that makes it look more like a water feature than a wetland. The drainage ditch behind a subdivision, engineered so precisely that it barely registers as nature at all. More infrastructure than habitat, something built by a contractor rather than grown by a swamp. Central Florida is laced with thousands of miles of this kind of water, canals dug to drain the land for development, retention ponds required by code to catch runoff, water hazards placed on golf courses because a fairway needs somewhere for the excess rain to go. None of it was designed with wildlife in mind. All of it was designed to move water efficiently around the people living beside it. Increasingly, something else has been moving into that water instead, and almost nobody involved in building it saw this coming. My name is Matteo. I have spent more than 3 decades working around wildlife. One snake near water usually means very little. But when isolated sightings become repeat sightings, and a species stops passing through and begins raising the next generation inside a place people believed belonged entirely to them, I pay attention. That is what makes this story different. Florida's built water systems are one of the defining infrastructures that allow much of the state to exist as it does. Large sections of Central and South Florida became suitable for development only after engineers spent decades digging canals and installing drainage networks to pull water off land that once flooded seasonally. Every new subdivision has continued that pattern on a smaller scale, using retention ponds or connected canals before houses can be permitted. The result is a state crisscrossed by an almost invisible second landscape, water that looks decorative or purely functional to the people living beside it, but that from an ecological standpoint behaves like a vast artificial wetland network stretching for hundreds of miles beneath the suburbs, golf courses, and shopping corridors built on top of it. And this is the first thing I want you to remember. Calling water infrastructure does not stop it from behaving like water. The cottonmouth is not a stranger to Florida. Anyone who has spent real time near the state's natural wetlands, the true swamps and river floodplains, the species has occupied for longer than the state itself has existed, already knows to watch where they step. A cottonmouth in a natural wetland is not the revelation here. That is where the animal belongs, and treating every encounter there as extraordinary would be dishonest. The story is what has been happening in the built environment instead, the manufactured water systems that were never supposed to function as habitat at all, and the growing body of reports suggesting the species has quietly figured out that a golf course water hazard and a natural slough are, from a snake's point of view, functionally similar enough to move into without hesitation. For most of the state's development history, this would not have seemed like a meaningful concern. Early stormwater canals tended to be simple, straight, heavily maintained channels, mowed to bare dirt on both banks and cleared of the kind of dense marginal vegetation a snake needs for cover. A canal like that offered water but little else, and wildlife biologists generally assumed it would stay that way, a functional piece of infrastructure too exposed and too disturbed to hold much beyond the occasional passing wader bird. What changed in newer developments is subtler, and subtle changes are often missed until wildlife has already adapted. Modern stormwater permitting increasingly requires retention systems to include planted littoral shelves, native aquatic vegetation, and a more naturalized bank profile. Those changes were made almost entirely for water quality and flood mitigation reasons, with no wildlife habitat intention behind them at all. But intention is a human concern. Habitat is measured by what is physically present. The unintended consequence has been retention ponds and connected canal networks that look far more like real wetland edge habitat than anything built a generation earlier, dense enough at the margins to offer real cover, calm enough at the centre to support a stable aquatic food web, and reliable enough to remain useful when natural wetlands become stressed by drought or development. Golf course superintendents across central Florida have started comparing notes. A pond with no snake complaints for years suddenly produces several A season. Maintenance crews mowing near cart paths give the water's edge a wider berth. Homeowners associations and developments built around connected drainage canals begin receiving steady reports. A snake sunning behind a fence, another near a spillway, another beside a paved maintenance path used by people walking dogs. Taken one at a time, none of these reports would concern people who understand Florida wildlife. One homeowner, one worker, or one snake near a pond proves little, but place the reports side by side across several seasons and the picture changes. What has caught the attention of herpetologists paying closer attention is the pattern underneath them, because the locations do not read like animals wandering opportunistically into unfamiliar territory and leaving again. They read like animals settling in. Repeat sightings at the same retention ponds across multiple seasons, evidence of breeding activity in canal systems that have no natural wetland connection anywhere nearby, meaning the population using that water is not simply passing through from an established wild population, but appears to be reproducing inside the built system itself. A snake moving through unfamiliar terrain once is an anecdote. A population establishing itself generation after generation inside a stormwater system built entirely by human engineers is something else. One wildlife trapper who fields nuisance calls across several central Florida counties has described the shift to colleagues in blunt, practical terms. A decade ago, a cottonmouth call from a gated golf community would have been unusual enough to remember individually. Now it barely registers as noteworthy, folded into the same routine list of calls as raccoons in an attic or an alligator sunning itself too close to a walking path. That quiet normalization matters. Dramatic events attract attention, but routine events reveal change. A species moving from remarkable to ordinary within one professional career can signal ecological adjustment more reliably than a single frightening photograph. This is where the explanations diverge, and the three most commonly offered do not just disagree about mechanism, they disagree about what kind of relationship humans and this species actually have with each other now. The first explanation treats the phenomenon as an accident of good design. Ironic as that sounds, retention ponds and golf course water hazards are required by regulation to hold water at a fairly stable managed level, control excess nutrient runoff, and support at least a baseline of aquatic vegetation and prey species to satisfy environmental permitting requirements. Taken together, those requirements accidentally produce something that looks, from a cottonmouth's perspective, remarkably close to an ideal slow water wetland. Calm water, abundant small fish and frogs drawn in by the same nutrient load the engineers were required to manage, dense marginal vegetation along the banks for cover, and none of the seasonal drying that stresses natural wetland populations during drought years. Under this theory, nobody built cottonmouth habitat on purpose, but the regulatory requirements meant to protect water quality happened to build near-perfect snake habitat as an unintended side effect, and the species simply recognized the opportunity before anyone else did. Engineers and permitting officials who hear the pattern described often react with resigned recognition rather than surprise, because it fits a broader lesson environmental regulation has encountered repeatedly. Any sufficiently naturalized water feature, built for whatever bureaucratic reason, will eventually begin attracting the wildlife that naturalized water features have always attracted, regardless of the paperwork behind its construction. The second explanation is less about what the water offers and more about what disappeared around it. Central Florida has lost an enormous share of its natural wetland acreage to development over the past several decades, and every acre of swamp or floodplain converted into a subdivision or shopping corridor represents habitat whose previous residents, cottonmouths included, did not simply vanish with the trees and water. Under this theory, the snakes showing up in canals and retention ponds are not colonizing new territory out of curiosity or opportunity. They are displaced populations pushed into the nearest available water that still functions the way their original habitat did, because the built water system was, in a very real sense, constructed on top of or adjacent to the wetland that used to be there. The snake is not moving towards suburbia. Suburbia moved toward the snake. Longtime residents of some older Central Florida communities, the ones built during the first major development boom decades ago, sometimes describe the surrounding landscape in a way that quietly supports this theory without meaning to. They mention that the golf course or the subdivision behind their street used to be low wet ground nobody wanted to build on until drainage technology caught up with ambition. If that memory's accurate, and old plat maps and aerial photographs often bear it out, then the retention pond, sitting behind a modern fence line, is not a new feature imposed on empty land. It may be the last visible remnant of exactly the kind of habitat the species always used, reduced to a fraction of its former size but never fully erased. The third explanation focuses on food, rather than water or displacement, and it is the one that increasingly concerns biologists who study prey dynamics rather than range maps. Suburban retention ponds and golf course water systems tend to accumulate unusually dense populations of certain prey species, particularly invasive fish, tolerant of managed nutrient-heavy water, along with rodent populations drawn to the landscaped, food-rich margins of suburban development. A water system that concentrates abundant, easy prey in a small area is, to a predator that hunts primarily by ambush and scent rather than pursuit, an extremely efficient place to live regardless of whether it began as wetland or infrastructure. Under this theory, the cottonmouth is not responding to habitat loss or clever engineering at all. It is simply following the food, the same way any predator would, into whatever water holds the most prey with the least effort required to catch it. The fact that the food happens to be concentrated by human landscaping is, from the snake's perspective, entirely beside the point. Biologists who favour this explanation point to something that often surprises people outside the field. Ambush predators like the cottonmouth can be remarkably efficient at recognising and exploiting a dense, reliable food source once they encounter one. Some settle into a home range far smaller than the species would use in a natural wetland simply because the prey density in a well-stocked retention pond makes wide-ranging movement unnecessary. A snake that no longer needs to travel far to eat well has very little reason to leave, regardless of how it arrived there in the first place. Wildlife officials resist choosing one explanation, and that caution is justified. Evidence supports pieces of all three without fully confirming any one. Nutrient and prey data, collected from several affected retention systems, does show elevated small fish and amphibian populations consistent with the food theory. Historical wetland maps overlaid against current development boundaries do show that a meaningful share of newly colonized canal systems sit directly atop or immediately adjacent to swamp acreage that existed within living memory, supporting the displacement theory. And the engineering requirements behind stormwater management genuinely have created stable, vegetated, slow water conditions that did not exist in that specific form before regulation required them, lending real weight to the accidental habitat theory as well. It is entirely possible that all three forces are operating on the same population at the same time, one factor pulling the snake in, another pushing it out of what used to be there, and a third making the water impossible to ignore once the snake arrives. What is not in question is the practical shift this represents for the people living alongside these systems, most of whom never expected to think about venomous wildlife when they bought a house backing onto a retention pond or a unit overlooking a golf course water hazard. Some homeowners associations have adjusted landscaping contracts to keep canal banks lower and sightlines clearer, not from panic, but from practical caution. Golf course crews discuss the snakes matter-of-factly as another occupational hazard absorbed into the daily routine. Nobody is draining the ponds, nobody is filling in the canals. The water serves its intended purpose, moving stormwater efficiently around a landscape that would otherwise flood, and it is going to keep existing whether or not a snake has decided to live in it. Removing the water is not a realistic option in a state where the modern footprint of central Florida depends on that drainage network functioning exactly as designed. That means whatever relationship develops between the built environment and the species now living inside parts of it will have to be managed rather than undone. What remains unresolved is whether this is a temporary adjustment that stabilizes once the population reaches its limits, or the beginning of something permanent. A quiet redrawing of what counts as wetland habitat as the state continues building water infrastructure. Biologists tracking these systems are honest about not knowing which. The canals were built for water. Nobody consulted the wetland they replaced, and nobody consulted the species that used to call it home about what would happen once the two met again on entirely new terms. There is something particular about the discomfort this creates, distinct from the fear people associate with wilder, more remote encounters with dangerous wildlife. A snake in a genuine swamp fits an expected narrative. Dangerous, perhaps, but dangerous in a place people already understood, required caution. A snake breeding quietly in a retention pond behind a fenced backyard, or hunting along the edge of a golf course water hazard between the fourth and fifth holes, unsettles a different assumption entirely. It challenges the belief that the built, managed, permitted parts of a landscape are somehow separate from the wild parts, safely on the human side of a line that development was supposed to draw once and for all. After decades around wildlife, I have come to distrust that line. Central Florida's water infrastructure was never meant to erase it completely. It was meant to move water efficiently and keep flooding predictable. But the same engineering has, almost as an afterthought, produced hundreds of miles of habitat convincing enough for a wetland predator to settle into and raise the next generation. That says less about the snake adapting to people than it does about how thin the line between engineered water and wild water may have always been. waiting only for something patient enough to notice that the difference did not matter as much as everyone assumed. My name is Matteo. I have spent more than 3 decades working around wildlife, and one thing I know is that the wild does not disappear simply because we put a fence around it, mow the grass, and give the water a different name. Sometimes it waits at the edge, sometimes it adapts, and sometimes, while everyone is looking somewhere else, it quietly moves back in. If you found this fascinating, subscribe for more stories about the animals adapting to the world humans built around them.